Echoing through the stifling air of courtroom 302, the judge's gavel slammed down like a gunshot. Officer Vance Whitaker stood completely frozen at the defense table. His trademark arrogant smirk had been replaced by a sickening, chalky pallor. Pulling over a black man in a luxury SUV late one rainy night was supposed to be an easy intimidation tactic. He thought he was bullying just another helpless citizen in the dark. He had absolutely no idea the man calmly sitting behind the wheel was Captain Darius Vale, his district's new commanding officer. That single racially motivated stop did not just end a corrupt career. It systematically dismantled an entire crooked regime, bringing devastating, inescapable karma down on a predator who truly believed he was untouchable. The night was unforgiving, a torrential downpour that turned the asphalt of Route 114 into a slick black mirror. Inside Squad Car 4A, the heater blew a weak stream of lukewarm air, barely cutting through the damp chill. At the wheel sat Officer Vance Whitaker, a veteran of the Oakridge Police Department, whose personnel file was as thick as a phone book, littered with excessive force complaints and racial profiling accusations that had all miraculously vanished under the protective wing of the local police union. Beside him sat rookie officer Ryan Kessler, barely out of the academy, clutching his thermal coffee mug like a lifeline. Whitaker was a man who thrived on authority. He had pale, watery eyes that constantly scanned the road, not for danger, but for victims. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, irritated by the slow night. "Nothing out here but wet dogs and ghosts, Kessler," Whitaker muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We need some action to keep the blood pumping." Ahead of them, the tail lights of a sleek, midnight blue Range Rover cut through the sheets of rain. The vehicle was maintaining a perfect speed, dead center in the right lane. It was not speeding. It was not swerving. It was, by all accounts, a model of lawful driving. But Whitaker narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly as his headlights washed over the SUV. Through the heavily tinted rear window, he could barely make out the silhouette of the driver. "Look at this guy," Whitaker sneered, a familiar dark tone creeping into his voice. "Out here late at night in a $100,000 rig. Probably running drugs up from the city." Ryan frowned, peering through the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. "He's going exactly the speed limit, Vance. Registration tags look up to date from here." "That's exactly how they drive when they're holding," Whitaker shot back, his hand hovering over the siren switch. "They drive too perfect. It's a dead giveaway." Before Ryan could articulate a defense, Whitaker flicked the switch. The squad car erupted into a frenzy of flashing red and blue strobe lights, piercing the darkness and painting the surrounding pine trees in frantic colors. The siren gave a short, aggressive yelp. Inside the Range Rover, Captain Darius Vale glanced in his rearview mirror. He was a decorated veteran of the state police who had just been transferred to Oakridge to clean up a precinct infamous for its corruption and civil rights violations. He was off duty, dressed comfortably in a gray hooded sweatshirt and dark jeans, exhausted after a grueling day of internal audits. He sighed, checking his speedometer. He knew he had not committed a single infraction. Vale engaged his right turn signal, smoothly pulling the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder of the highway, bringing it to a gentle stop beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. He placed the vehicle in park, rolled down his driver's side window completely to ensure full visibility, and placed both hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He did not reach for his glove box. He did not dig into his pockets. He waited, his demeanor utterly tranquil, his mind sharp. In the squad car, Whitaker threw it into park and unclipped his radio. "Dispatch, 4A, initiating a traffic stop on Route 114 northbound, just past the mile marker. Midnight blue Range Rover." Copy 4A, the dispatcher crackled back. Reason for stop? Whitaker did not miss a beat. Failure to maintain lane, erratically crossing the yellow line. Ryan looked at Whitaker, his stomach twisting. Vance, he didn't cross the line. Watch and learn, Kessler, Whitaker said, stepping out into the pouring rain, ignoring the rookie's protest. He did not bother putting on a rain jacket. He wanted to look imposing. He rested his right hand heavily on the butt of his holstered service weapon, a blatant intimidation tactic, and began his slow, aggressive saunter toward the SUV, intentionally shining his heavy-duty maglite directly into the driver's side mirror to blind the occupant. As Whitaker approached the window, he shone the blinding beam of the flashlight directly into Vale's face. Vale did not flinch. He merely blinked against the harsh light, his expression unreadable. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Whitaker barked over the sound of the rain, leaning down so his face was inches from the open window. He did not offer a greeting. He did not state the reason for the stop. Good evening, officer, Vale said, his voice deep, calm, and resonant. Could you tell me why I was pulled over? I asked the questions, buddy. Whitaker snapped, his jaw tightening. He hated being questioned. He hated it even more when the person questioning him did not sound afraid. I said license and registration now, or we can do this the hard way. Vale maintained eye contact, his composure unyielding. My wallet is in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I will reach for them slowly. Just get it, Whitaker commanded, shining the flashlight down into the cab, scanning the interior for anything he could use as probable cause. Vale moved with deliberate slowness. He reached behind him, retrieving a plain brown leather wallet. He extracted his civilian driver's license, deliberately leaving his gold captain's badge hidden in a separate credential case in the center console. He wanted to see exactly how this officer operated when he thought nobody of consequence was watching. He handed the license and the registration out the window. Whitaker snatched the documents, holding them under his flashlight. He read the name. Darius Vale. He looked back at Vale, a sneer curling his lip. Whose car is this, Darius? You borrowed this from your boss? It is my vehicle, Vale replied evenly. Right, Whitaker scoffed. A guy like you driving a car like this, step out of the vehicle. Ryan, who had walked up to the passenger side of the vehicle, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He tapped the roof of the car gently, trying to get Whitaker's attention. Vance, everything looks clear here. The tags match the license. I said step out of the car, Darius! Whitaker shouted, ignoring his partner, his hand gripping his gun harder. You're acting suspicious. I'm ordering you out of the vehicle for my safety. The rain battered the roof of the Range Rover, sounding like 1,000 tiny drums. The tension in the damp air was thick enough to choke on. Vale looked at the young officer on the passenger side, Ryan, noting the pale, frightened look on the kid's face. Then he looked back at Whitaker, whose eyes were wide with a manufactured, adrenaline-fueled rage. Officer, Vale said, his tone still perfectly measured, though carrying a distinct note of authority that Whitaker was too arrogant to recognize. I am perfectly willing to comply with a lawful order. However, I must inform you that I am carrying a licensed firearm. It is secured in a lockbox under my seat. Whitaker's reaction was instantaneous and violently disproportionate. He yanked his service weapon from its holster, pointing it directly at Vale's chest. Gun! He's got a gun. Hands on the wheel. Keep your hands on the wheel. Ryan gasped, stumbling back from the passenger window, his hand instinctively flying to his own weapon, though he did not draw it. Vance, wait. He just told you about it. Shut up, Kessler, Whitaker screamed, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. Darius, with your left hand, open the door from the outside. Move slow or I will put you down right here. Do you understand me? Vale felt a cold, righteous anger blooming in his chest, but he locked it away. This was exactly why he had been sent to Oakridge. The department was a festering wound of constitutional violations, and Officer Vance Whitaker was the infection made flesh. "I am complying," Vale said smoothly. He used his left hand to reach out the window, pulling the exterior door handle. The heavy door swung open, the rain immediately blowing into the warm cabin. "Out! Face the car! Hands on the roof!" Whitaker ordered, stepping back to maintain his firing angle. Vale stepped out into the storm. He was a tall, powerfully built man, standing 6'3", his presence alone commanding a natural respect. He calmly turned around and placed his hands flat on the wet roof of his SUV. Whitaker holstered his weapon, stepping forward and aggressively grabbing Vale's wrists, twisting them behind his back with unnecessary force. He slapped a pair of cold steel handcuffs onto Vale's wrists, ratcheting them down so tightly the metal bit into the bone. "You're making a massive mistake, officer," Vale stated quietly. "The only mistake here is you thinking you could ride through my town." Whitaker whispered maliciously into Vale's ear, patting him down roughly. Finding nothing else, Whitaker shoved Vale against the side of the vehicle. "Kessler, go search the car. Find the lockbox." Ryan hesitated, wiping rain from his eyes. "Vance, we don't have probable cause to search the vehicle. He hasn't committed a crime. The gun is secured." Whitaker spun around, his face purple with fury. "Are you deaf, rookie? I have probable cause." He was swerving. "He's acting agitated, and he has a weapon. Search the damn car before I write you up for insubordination." Ryan swallowed hard, his conscience screaming at him, but his fear of his training officer overpowered it. He moved to the driver's side, pulling out his flashlight. He leaned into the vehicle. It was immaculately clean. He looked under the seat and saw a heavy black steel lockbox bolted to the floorboards. "I see the box, Vance. It's locked. We need a warrant for this." Whitaker marched over, shoving Ryan out of the way. "We don't need a warrant if we find something else in plain sight." Whitaker began rummaging aggressively through the center console, tossing pristine maps and mints onto the passenger seat. He popped open the glove compartment, scattering registration papers. "Stop," Vale said from his position against the car, his voice slicing through the sound of the rain like a razor. It was the first time his tone had changed. It was no longer the voice of a cooperative citizen. It was the voice of command. "Officer Kessler." Ryan looked at the man in handcuffs. "Sir, in the center console beneath the cup holder tray, there is a red leather credential case. I suggest you open it before your partner commits a federal civil rights violation." Whitaker laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "What is it, Darius? Your fake FBI badge you bought online? Let's see it." Whitaker reached into the console, ripping the tray up and grabbing the red leather case. He flipped it open under the glare of his flashlight. The heavy gold shield gleamed even in the dim light, intricate and authoritative. Next to it was a laminated identification card bearing the seal of the state police and the Oakridge Police Department. Captain Darius Vale, Division Commander, Internal Affairs. Whitaker froze. The air seemed to rush out of his lungs. He stared at the badge, then looked at the ID card, then looked at the towering, handcuffed man standing in the rain. For a brief, agonizing second, the reality of the situation crashed down on Whitaker. The man he had just illegally stopped, unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, and whose car he was currently illegally searching, was not just a police officer. He was the absolute highest-ranking officer in his direct chain of command, a man sent by the state specifically to root out bad cops. Ryan, leaning over Whitaker's shoulder, read the ID. He staggered back a step, his face draining of all color. "Oh my God, Captain." Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized Whitaker's brain. In a rational world, he would have instantly unlocked the cuffs, apologized profusely, and begged for his job. But Vance Whitaker's ego was a fragile, toxic thing. When backed into a corner, he doubled down. His twisted logic kicked in. If I admit who he is, I'm fired and going to jail. If I claim it's a fake badge, I can book him, get the union involved, and muddy the waters before the brass finds out. Fake? Whitaker choked out, his voice pitching an octave higher than normal. It's a fake badge. Impersonating a police officer is a felony, Darius. Ryan stared at his partner in sheer horror. Vance, are you insane? Look at the seal. Look at the watermark on the ID. That is real. Shut up, Kessler, Whitaker roared, slamming the credential case into his pocket. He grabbed Vale by the arm and shoved him violently toward the squad car. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Vale did not fight back. He allowed himself to be pushed into the cramped plastic back seat of the cruiser. As the door slammed shut, locking him in the cage, Vale looked out the window at Whitaker. He was not scared. He was calculating. He knew every policy Whitaker had violated, every law he had broken. Whitaker climbed into the driver's seat, his hands shaking so violently he could barely put the car in gear. Ryan got into the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, paralyzed by the career-ending train wreck he was strapped into. You're a witness, Kessler, Whitaker hissed, throwing the car into drive. He crossed the yellow line. He was aggressive. He reached for a weapon, and he had a counterfeit badge. That is the story. You deviate from that, and the union will make sure you never wear a badge in any state in this country. Do you hear me? From the back seat in the darkness, Vale spoke quietly. Officer Kessler, you have a choice to make. By the time we reach the precinct, I advise you to make the right one. The drive back to the 8th precinct was conducted in a suffocating, terrifying silence. The wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield, keeping time with the pounding pulse in Whitaker's temples. He was sweating profusely despite the chill of the cruiser. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw Vale sitting there, perfectly composed, watching him with eyes that felt like they were recording his very soul. They pulled into the sally port of the precinct. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the stark concrete walls. Whitaker threw the car into park and marched around to the back, hauling the door open. He grabbed Vale by the bicep, hauling him out roughly. Let's go, tough guy. Whitaker grunted, trying desperately to maintain the facade of control. They walked through the heavy steel doors into the booking area. The room smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and old coffee. At the high booking desk sat Desk Sergeant Elias Thorpe, a longtime veteran with a graying mustache who was counting down the days to his pension. A few other officers were milling about, filling out paperwork or chatting by the coffee machine. Got a live one, Sarge, Whitaker announced loudly, trying to project confidence. Impersonating an officer, resisting arrest, carrying a concealed weapon. Sergeant Thorpe looked up from his ledger, pushing his reading glasses down his nose. His eyes drifted from Whitaker down to the tall, handcuffed black man in the gray hoodie. Thorpe squinted. He leaned forward over the desk. The blood slowly drained from Thorpe's face until he looked like he had seen a ghost. Thorpe had been at the morning briefing earlier that week. He had seen the photographs. He had read the memos. Whitaker, Thorpe whispered, his voice trembling. What? What have you done? I caught him on 114, Whitaker said, his voice loud, trying to perform for the room. Driving a high-end Rover, swerving, tried to flash a fake gold shield at me to get out of it. The room went dead silent. The officers by the coffee machine stopped mid-sentence. Every eye in the booking area locked onto Vale. Take the cuffs off him, Vance, Thorpe said, his voice suddenly sharp, carrying an edge of sheer panic. Take them off right now, Sarge. He's a felony suspect. I said take the damn cuffs off him, Thorpe roared, slamming his heavy fist onto the wooden desk so hard the coffee mugs rattled. Do you have any idea who you are holding? Vale stepped forward, turning his back to Whitaker. Do as the sergeant says, Officer Whitaker. Whitaker's hands were trembling uncontrollably now. He fumbled with the keys, his bravado finally shattering under the weight of the room's horrified silence. The cuffs clicked open, and Vale rubbed his raw red wrists, bringing his hands to the front. Vale reached into his pocket, a movement that made Whitaker instinctively flinch, and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number, holding the phone to his ear. Yes, Deputy Chief, Vale said into the phone, his voice echoing clearly in the silent room. This is Captain Vale. I need you down at the 8th Precinct booking area immediately. Bring Internal Affairs Detectives Ramirez and Hayes. Yes, we have an officer involved in a multi-level felony civil rights violation. I have his badge number. It's Officer Vance Whitaker. Whitaker physically stumbled backward, hitting the cinder block wall. You can't. Vale hung up the phone and turned to face Whitaker. The commanding aura radiating from him was palpable. Officer Whitaker, as of this exact second, you are stripped of your police powers. You are suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Surrender your weapon and your badge to Sergeant Thorpe. Whitaker looked frantically at the other officers in the room, searching for an ally, searching for the blue wall of silence he had relied on for years to cover his abuses. But the officers all looked away. Even the most hardened among them knew Whitaker had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had gone after the king, and he had missed. Slowly, with shaking hands, Whitaker unbuckled his gun belt and laid it on the booking desk. He unpinned his silver star and set it next to the gun. Officer Kessler, Vale said, turning to the rookie who was standing near the door, looking like he was going to vomit. Yes, sir, Kessler snapped to attention. Go to the interview room, Vale commanded gently but firmly. Write down every single detail of what occurred tonight. Do not omit a single word. If you write the truth, your career survives tonight. If you lie to protect him, you will share a cell with him. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir, Kessler said, practically sprinting toward the hallway. In the months that followed, the Union had tried everything. They tried to claim Whitaker was suffering from PTSD. They tried to claim the lighting on the highway made it impossible to see the badge clearly. They tried to quietly sweep it under the rug with a resignation and a quiet transfer to a county sheriff's department 2 towns over. But Captain Darius Vale was not interested in sweeping anything under the rug. He had meticulously compiled the evidence. He had Kessler's sworn testimony, the dash cam footage from the cruiser that contradicted Whitaker's claim of swerving, and the audio recording of Whitaker explicitly ignoring protocol and escalating the situation due to clear racial bias. Whitaker did not just get fired, he was indicted by a federal grand jury. The scene shifts to the imposing architecture of the federal district courthouse. Courtroom 302 was packed. The mahogany pews were filled with local reporters, civil rights advocates, and dozens of off-duty police officers. Some there to support Whitaker out of a misplaced sense of loyalty, but many more there to witness the end of an era. Whitaker sat at the defense table, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit that seemed to swallow his suddenly diminished frame. His high-priced defense attorney, Quentin Hodge, looked stressed, constantly shuffling papers and wiping his brow. Whitaker had spent the months living in a state of arrogant denial, convinced the system that had protected him for so long would save him again. But as the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, that delusion finally shattered. Captain Darius Vale walked down the center aisle. He was dressed in his full Class A dress uniform. The brass buttons gleamed, the rows of commendation ribbons resting proudly on his chest, the gold eagles of his rank pinned crisply to his collar. He did not look angry. He looked like an instrument of absolute, uncompromising justice. As Vale took his seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, Whitaker felt a cold knot of pure terror tighten in his stomach. The gavel slammed down, echoing through the stifling air, and the judge's voice boomed through the room. All rise. The United States of America versus Vance Whitaker. The trap had sprung. The hammer was about to fall, and Whitaker was about to learn that karma does not just bite, it devours. The air in federal courtroom 302 was thick with anticipation, the kind of heavy silence that precedes a violent storm. Judge Victor Langford, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for mercilessly striking down legal theatrics, peered over his wire-rimmed glasses at the defense table. Vance Whitaker sat rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. The arrogance that had defined his years on the Oakridge police force was gone, replaced by the cornered animal panic of a man realizing his usual lifelines had been cut. Lead federal prosecutor Nora Blake stood at the podium. She was methodical, brilliant, and possessed a courtroom presence that made even veteran defense attorneys sweat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Blake began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "This is not a case about a split-second decision made in the heat of a dangerous moment. This is a case about a predator who used a taxpayer-funded badge as a license to hunt." Officer Vance Whitaker did not pull over Captain Darius Vale because of a traffic violation. He pulled him over because of the color of his skin, the car he was driving, and the absolute certainty that as a police officer in Oakridge, he would face zero consequences for his actions. Quentin Hodge, Whitaker's high-priced union lawyer, immediately launched into a frantic defense during his opening statement. He painted Whitaker as a proactive, dedicated public servant suffering from undiagnosed stress. Officer Whitaker was working a dark, dangerous highway, Hodge argued, pacing in front of the jury box. He saw a vehicle acting suspiciously. When he approached the driver, who, yes, turned out to be a captain, was uncooperative and stated he had a weapon. Officer Whitaker reacted as he was trained to do. He secured the scene to ensure he went home to his family that night. But the prosecution's first witness blew that narrative entirely out of the water. When Ryan Kessler's name was called, a murmur rippled through the gallery where dozens of off-duty Oakridge cops sat. The blue wall of silence, the unwritten rule that cops never testify against cops, was the foundation of Whitaker's entire worldview. Seeing his former rookie partner walk through the swinging wooden gates and take the oath was the first real hammer blow to Whitaker's fragile psyche. Kessler looked pale, but his voice was steady. Under Blake's questioning, he systematically dismantled every lie on Whitaker's official arrest report. "Officer Kessler, did the vehicle ever cross the yellow line?" Blake asked. "No, ma'am," Kessler replied, refusing to look at Whitaker. "The vehicle was maintaining the lane perfectly. We had no probable cause for the stop, and when Captain Vale informed Officer Whitaker about his legally secured firearm, was he aggressive?" "No, he was completely calm. He kept his hands visible." Officer Whitaker drew his weapon immediately and began screaming. Hodge practically leaped out of his chair for cross-examination. His strategy was to paint Kessler as a terrified rookie who was bullied by internal affairs into testifying against his mentor to save his own job. "Officer Kessler, isn't it true you were intimidated by Captain Vale?" Hodge sneered. "Isn't it true you're only sitting here today changing your story because internal affairs threatened to ruin your life if you didn't give them a scapegoat?" "Objection. Badgering," Blake called out calmly. "Sustained, Mr. Hodge," Judge Langford warned. "Dial it back." Kessler leaned forward, finally locking eyes with Whitaker across the room. "Nobody threatened me, sir. I'm sitting here because I watched my training officer violate a man's constitutional rights, assault him, and then order me to lie about it on a federal document. I became a cop to stop criminals, Mr. Hodge, not to ride shotgun with one. The gallery gasped, Whitaker's face drained of blood. Hodge swallowed hard, his face flushing red, and quickly dismissed the witness. But the prosecution was not done. The real twist was yet to come. Hodge had filed a pretrial motion to suppress the dashcam footage from squad car 4A, claiming the hard drive in the vehicle had mysteriously corrupted due to water damage from the rain that night. It was a classic Oakridge PD cover-up tactic, but Blake smiled as she called her next witness, the precinct's IT director. Mr. Hodge claims the footage is gone, Blake said to the jury. What Officer Whitaker did not know is that weeks before this incident, Captain Vale ordered a precinct-wide software update. Every dash cam in Oakridge now automatically mirrors its data to a secure off-site cloud server the moment the sirens are activated. The local hard drive might have been accidentally wiped, but the cloud remembers everything. The courtroom lights dimmed. The large screens flickered to life. The jury watched in high definition as the midnight blue Range Rover drove perfectly straight. They heard Whitaker's voice clear as day on the interior mic. Look at this guy out here late at night in a $100,000 rig, probably running drugs. That's exactly how they drive when they're holding, rookie. They watched Whitaker draw his gun on a perfectly compliant man. They heard the raw, racist vitriol in his voice. The visual evidence was devastating. There was no split-second fear for his life. There was only malice. The atmosphere in the courthouse reached a boiling point as the trial progressed. The prosecution called their star witness. The state calls Captain Darius Vale. Vale walked to the witness stand with the same measured, unshakable composure he had displayed on the rain-slicked highway. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit. As he swore to tell the truth, his eyes briefly met Whitaker's. There was no triumph in Vale's gaze. There was only the cold, mechanical precision of an auditor inspecting a condemned building. Blake walked Vale through the events of the night. Vale recounted the stop flawlessly, his memory eidetic. He explained police protocol, use of force continuum, and probable cause, completely eviscerating Whitaker's claim that standard procedure was followed. Captain Vale? Blake asked, pacing near the jury box. Why did you wait to reveal your badge until after you were handcuffed and your vehicle was being illegally searched? Because, Vale replied, his deep voice commanding the absolute attention of everyone in the room. If I had flashed my shield immediately, Officer Whitaker would have let me go with a forced smile and a, "Have a good night, Captain." And the very next night, he would have done the exact same thing to a civilian who did not have a gold badge to protect them. I needed to see exactly how the citizens of Oakridge were being treated in the dark. When it was Hodge's turn to cross-examine, the defense attorney looked like a man walking to his own execution. He had nothing to work with. He tried his only remaining tactic, baiting the witness. He wanted to make Vale look angry, aggressive, or vindictive, hoping to play on the jury's subconscious biases. Captain Vale, you clearly have an agenda against my client, Hodge probed, leaning on the podium. You came to Oakridge to make a name for yourself, didn't you? You set a trap for Officer Whitaker. You deliberately acted suspiciously to provoke a confrontation so you could ruin his career. Vale did not raise his voice. He did not shift in his seat. Mr. Hodge, driving the speed limit and maintaining my lane is not acting suspiciously. Complying with commands is not provoking a confrontation. Your client ruined his own career the moment he decided the law did not apply to him. But this was an isolated incident, Hodge insisted, his voice rising in desperation. A single bad night, and you're trying to send a man with a family to federal prison for a mistake? Blake stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is opening the door to character and prior conduct. Judge Langford looked at Hodge with raised eyebrows. Are you sure you want to go down this road, Counselor? You've just claimed this was an isolated incident. The prosecution is now entitled to rebut that. Hodge, realizing his fatal error too late, opened his mouth to withdraw the statement, but the damage was done. "I'll allow it," Langford ruled. "The prosecution may proceed on redirect." Blake approached the witness stand, a stack of thick manila folders in her arms. This was the karma hitting back with the force of a freight train. "Captain Vale," Blake said, handing the folders to the bailiff to enter into evidence. "During the months Officer Whitaker was suspended awaiting trial, what did you do?" "As the head of internal affairs, I initiated a comprehensive audit of Officer Whitaker's arrest record over the course of his career," Vale answered. "And what did you find?" Vale adjusted his posture, looking directly at the jury. "I found a distinct, calculated pattern and practice of civil rights violations. Officer Whitaker specialized in late-night traffic stops, targeting minority drivers in affluent neighborhoods. We found numerous highly questionable stops." Blake turned to the gallery. "Your Honor, the state calls Nolan Pendleton." An older, dignified black man in a tweed jacket stepped through the courtroom doors. Whitaker slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face. "Mr. Pendleton is the principal of Oakridge North High School," Blake explained to the court. "Years earlier, he was pulled over by Officer Whitaker. He was dragged from his car, accused of smelling like marijuana, and held in a cell before the charges were mysteriously dropped. His car was impounded and he nearly lost his pension." Blake pointed to the gallery doors again. "The state also calls Cole Thompson, an emergency room nurse, and Darius Lewis, a local business owner, both subjected to the exact same treatment by the defendant." The courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge had to bang his gavel 3 times to restore order. Vale had not just caught Whitaker breaking the law, he had systematically dismantled the corrupt machinery that allowed Whitaker to operate. By auditing the past, Vale had brought Whitaker's buried victims into the light. The defense's narrative of a stressed cop making a one-time mistake evaporated into thin air. Whitaker was not a victim of a high-stress job. He was a serial abuser who had finally pulled over the wrong man. The closing arguments in Federal Courtroom 302 felt less like a legal proceeding and more like an autopsy of a corrupted soul. Prosecutor Nora Blake stood before the jury box, her gaze sweeping across the 12 men and women who held Vance Whitaker's fate in their hands. The air conditioning hummed, a low drone beneath the heavy weight of the evidence that had been meticulously laid out over the past weeks. "Quentin Hodge wants you to believe that Vance Whitaker was a victim of a high-stress environment," Blake began, her voice ringing with clear, cold precision. "He wants you to believe that the badge he wore was a heavy burden that occasionally caused him to stumble. But you have seen the dashcam footage. You have heard the cloud-recovered audio. You have listened to the heartbreaking testimonies of Nolan Pendleton, Cole Thompson, and Darius Lewis, men who were humiliated, terrorized, and nearly ruined by the defendant simply because they drove nice cars while having the wrong skin color in the wrong neighborhood." Blake turned and pointed directly at Whitaker, who shrank visibly in his chair. "That badge was not a burden to Vance Whitaker. It was a weapon. And on the night of the incident, he aimed that weapon at Captain Darius Vale. He thought he was hunting a sheep in the dark. He had no idea he had cornered a lion. We ask you to return a verdict of guilty on all counts: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, aggravated assault, and obstruction of justice." When Hodge delivered his closing, it was a hollow, defeated echo. He begged for leniency, relying on worn-out cliches about the thin blue line, but the jury's faces were stone. They had seen behind the curtain, and the rot was undeniable. Judge Victor Langford formally instructed the jury, and they filed out to deliberate. But while the jury debated Whitaker's fate, Captain Darius Vale was already detonating the next explosive charge in his master plan. The twist that Vance Whitaker never saw coming was that his trial was merely the opening act. As Whitaker sat in a holding cell, nervously awaiting the verdict, A fleet of black SUVs bearing the gold seal of the FBI pulled up to the Oakridge Police Union headquarters and the former deputy chief's private residence. When Vale had ordered the precinct-wide cloud backup of the dash cams, he had not just secured video files. He, alongside internal affairs detectives Ramirez and Hayes, had secretly mirrored the precinct's entire internal email server and the union's grievance database. They found the digital paper trail, emails from Union President Richard Cobb to the former precinct captain, detailing exactly how to alter use of force reports to protect officers like Whitaker. They found the fix-it spreadsheets where civilian complaints of racial profiling were deliberately misclassified as clerical errors and buried in the archives. While the jury deliberated Whitaker's guilt, the federal government indicted 6 more individuals, effectively decapitating the corrupt leadership that had enabled Whitaker for years. The blue wall of silence had not just cracked. Vale had rigged it with dynamite and blown it to ash. Hours later, the buzzer in courtroom 302 sounded. The jury had reached a verdict. Whitaker was led back to the defense table. His hands shook so violently he had to clasp them together in his lap. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged schoolteacher, stood up, holding the slip of paper. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant Vance Whitaker guilty. Whitaker squeezed his eyes shut. On the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice and official oppression, guilty. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Whitaker collapsed forward, sobbing openly into his hands, the arrogant predator entirely broken. He looked back at the gallery, searching for his police buddies, searching for Richard Cobb or anyone from the Union to offer a lifeline. But the seats designated for his supporters were empty. They were all busy calling their own defense attorneys. Judge Langford did not even grant bail pending sentencing. "Mr. Whitaker," the judge said coldly, "you are a disgrace to the uniform and a danger to the public trust. You are remanded immediately to federal custody." 2 U.S. Marshals stepped forward. They hauled Whitaker to his feet. As they pulled his arms behind his back, the sharp click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the room. It was the exact same sound Whitaker had subjected so many innocent men to in the dark. Only this time the cuffs were not coming off. The final chapter of Vance Whitaker's story had to be written not in the fleeting adrenaline of a highway traffic stop, but in the cold, indelible ink of federal law. Sentencing day arrived. The sky outside the towering federal district courthouse, a bleak, monolithic slab of slate gray, threatening freezing rain that mirrored the frigid atmosphere inside courtroom 302. Over the months that followed, the landscape of the Oakridge Police Department had been entirely and aggressively transformed. Under Captain Darius Vale's unwavering surgical command, the department had been fundamentally purged of its toxic elements. The officers who had previously stood by, arms folded in silent complicity, while men like Whitaker terrorized the populace, found themselves facing a stark ultimatum: resign quietly with whatever dignity they had left, or face the relentless microscopic scrutiny of Vale's newly empowered Internal Affairs Division. Most chose the former. The collateral damage to the corrupt establishment was absolute. The digital paper trail Vale had covertly secured from the precinct's cloud servers had detonated like a daisy cutter bomb through the local political landscape. Richard Cobb, the arrogant police union president who had built a career on shielding abusive cops from accountability, was now facing his own federal indictment for racketeering and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The blue wall of silence had not merely cracked. It had been rigged with constitutional dynamite and reduced to fine white ash. When the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 swung open, a collective hush fell over the packed gallery. Vance Whitaker was escorted down the center aisle by 2 towering United States Marshals. There was no tailored suit today to project false authority. There was no silver star pinned to his chest. He wore a shapeless, glaringly bright orange federal prison jumpsuit. His wrists were secured in heavy steel handcuffs attached to a thick belly chain, and his ankles were bound by iron shackles that clinked harshly against the polished mahogany floor with every shuffling, defeated step. Whitaker was a ghost of the predator who had prowled Route 114. He had visibly aged in a matter of months. His previously slicked-back hair was thinning and unkempt. His complexion possessed a sickly, sallow pallor, and his shoulders were permanently slumped under the crushing psychological weight of his new reality. The man who had once thrived on inducing terror was now entirely consumed by it. The grim reality of a lengthy stint in a maximum security federal penitentiary, a brutal ecosystem where former abusive law enforcement officers are forced into solitary protective custody just to survive, had thoroughly shattered his fragile ego. He was led to the defense table, sinking into the wooden chair like a puppet with its strings severed. He dared not look back at the gallery. If he had, he would have realized the true extent of his isolation. The seats usually reserved for the fraternity of off-duty police officers, the men he thought were his brothers, were entirely empty. They had abandoned him the moment the federal indictments began raining down. Instead, the pews were filled to capacity with the citizens of Oakridge. Judge Victor Langford, his expression carved from granite, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the courtroom. This court is now in session for the formal sentencing of Vance Whitaker. The court will now hear victim impact statements. The first to walk through the wooden gates was Nolan Pendleton, the high school principal. He stood tall, adjusting his tweed jacket, projecting a quiet, dignified strength that Whitaker had once tried to strip away in the mud of a highway shoulder. "Your Honor," Pendleton began, his voice echoing clearly in the cavernous room. "Years earlier, this man pulled me over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. He dragged me from my vehicle, threw me to the asphalt, and laughed while he told me my career was over. He locked me in a cage based on fabricated charges that were quietly dropped only when I threatened to drain my life savings on a lawyer." Pendleton turned his body, forcing Whitaker to look at him. Whitaker kept his eyes glued to the defense table, his jaw trembling. "You took my dignity, Mr. Whitaker," Pendleton continued, his voice rising with righteous conviction. "You made me fear the very people I pay taxes to employ. You made my teenage son terrified of the flashing lights of a police cruiser. But today, standing here looking at you in those chains, I don't feel fear. I don't even feel anger anymore. I just feel profound pity. You traded your humanity for a fleeting, pathetic sense of power, and now you are left with absolutely nothing." Next to the podium came Cole Thompson, an emergency room nurse. He detailed how Whitaker had profiled him outside of the hospital after a grueling shift, violently searching his vehicle and threatening him with a dog unit simply because Thompson had questioned the legality of the stop. "You told me that night that I had no rights you had to respect," Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion. "You told me you were the law. You were wrong. The law is the man sitting in the front row who finally stopped you. You were just a thug with a taxpayer-funded gun." Darius Lewis, a local business owner who had nearly lost his commercial license due to Whitaker's falsified reports, spoke last, delivering a scathing indictment of the financial and emotional ruin Whitaker had inflicted on his family. By the time the civilian victims were finished, the atmosphere in the courtroom was incredibly heavy, thick with the undeniable truth of Whitaker's serial abuses. Then Judge Langford nodded toward the prosecution table. "The court recognizes Captain Darius Vale." Vale stood and walked to the podium. He was dressed immaculately in his Class A dress uniform. The brass buttons caught the dull winter light filtering through the high windows, and the gold eagles on his collar gleamed with uncompromising authority. He did not look at Whitaker with hatred. He looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon who had successfully excised a malignant tumor from a patient. "Your Honor." Vale's deep, resonant voice filled the room, commanding the absolute attention of every soul present. The badge of a police officer is not a shield behind which a coward can hide his prejudices. It is not a weapon forged to enforce a personal, twisted hierarchy. It is a sacred contract with the public. It represents a promise that the most vulnerable among us will be protected and that the laws of this nation apply equally to everyone, regardless of their zip code, their bank account, or the color of their skin. Vale paused, turning his head slightly to look directly at the man in the orange jumpsuit. Whitaker finally looked up, his pale eyes filled with tears, unable to escape the piercing gaze of the captain who had orchestrated his downfall. "Vance Whitaker did not just assault me on that highway," Vale continued, his tone methodical and unyielding. "He assaulted the foundational trust of a democratic society. He believed that the dark of the night and the silence of his peers would hide his sins forever. He believed that karma was a myth for the weak. But karma is not a myth, Your Honor. It is the inevitable mathematical result of arrogance colliding with the truth. We ask this court to impose the absolute maximum sentence, not out of vengeance, for a man this broken requires no further vengeance, but as a permanent, undeniable warning to anyone in law enforcement who mistakes a badge for a crown." Vale stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat, his posture perfectly straight. The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Langford leaned forward, steepling his fingers on the high mahogany bench. He looked down at Whitaker, and the sheer disgust on the judge's face made the former officer flinch. "Vance Whitaker, stand up." The defense attorney, Quentin Hodge, gently nudged his client. Whitaker practically had to be hauled to his feet, his chains rattling loudly, his knees visibly shaking. "In my years on the federal bench," Judge Langford began, his voice a low, terrifying rumble, "I have sentenced cartel leaders, corrupt politicians, and violent felons. But there is a special, profound category of contempt reserved for a man like you. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and instead, you treated it like discarded paper. You hunted the citizens of Oakridge. You operated a localized reign of terror under the cowardly protection of a uniform you were entirely unworthy to wear." Langford picked up his pen, signing the official sentencing document with a sharp, aggressive flourish. "The jury has found you guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, and obstruction of justice. I am denying the defense's request for downward departure. Mr. Whitaker, I sentence you to a lengthy term in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There will be no parole in the federal system." Whitaker let out a choked, wet gasp, his head dropping toward his chest, but the judge was not finished. The hard karma had not yet completed its sweep. "Furthermore," Langford continued, raising his voice over the murmurs of the gallery, "under the provisions of federal forfeiture laws and the civil rights statutes, you are hereby permanently decertified from acting as a law enforcement officer anywhere in the United States. In addition, to satisfy the financial restitution owed to Mr. Pendleton, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Lewis, and the numerous other victims identified in the state's audit, I am ordering the complete and total forfeiture of your municipal police pension. Every cent you thought you secured for your retirement will be distributed to the men and women whose lives you attempted to destroy." Whitaker's legs finally gave out. He collapsed backward into his chair, sobbing openly, a pathetic, broken shell of a man. The realization that he had lost everything, his freedom, his career, his identity, and his entire financial future, crashed over him like a tidal wave of concrete. The karma was absolute, thorough, and utterly merciless. "This court is adjourned," Langford declared, bringing the heavy wooden gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Let's go," one of the marshals grunted, hauling Whitaker up by his armpits. They turned him around, and as they marched him toward the side door leading to the holding cells, Whitaker dragged his feet, his shackles scraping against the floor in a miserable rhythm. He disappeared behind the heavy steel door, effectively erased from society, destined to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder in a concrete box. Captain Darius Vale stood up, smoothing his uniform jacket. He turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. As he reached the heavy wooden double doors at the back, the citizens in the gallery, Nolan Pendleton, Cole Thompson, and dozens of others, stood up. They did not cheer, and they did not applaud. They simply offered him a quiet, profound nod of respect. It was the deepest form of gratitude a community could give. Vale pushed open the doors and stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp, biting winter air. The threatening rain had finally broken, and a few rays of pale golden sunlight were beginning to pierce through the heavy gray clouds, illuminating the wet pavement of the city streets. He looked out over the city of Oakridge. The storm was over. The rot had been excised. For the first time in years, the citizens of this city could look at a black and white police cruiser and see a shield meant to protect them rather than a predator waiting in the dark. The spectacular downfall of Vance Whitaker serves as a stark, modern-day reminder that systemic arrogance eventually engineers its own destruction. Power unchecked breeds a dangerous delusion of invincibility, but karma, especially when wielded by those with the integrity to document the truth, is an uncompromising force. Captain Darius Vale did not just survive a racially motivated traffic stop. He utilized it as a masterclass in accountability, turning a predator's own tactics into the very evidence that dismantled a corrupt regime. Real justice rarely happens by accident. It requires the courage to stand in the dark, the patience to gather the facts, and the unshakable resolve to bring the hidden rot into the blinding light of a courtroom. In the end, Whitaker learned the hardest lesson of all. A badge can grant authority, but it cannot shield you from the absolute consequences of your own malice.